everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and take a look at the Nintendo DSi and see how this particular gaming console holds up in 2025. Now, the Nintendo DSi came out many years ago, back in around 2008. So this thing was a really interesting console, and the thing I can definitely tell you about the DSi, in my personal opinion, is that this is one of those types of gaming consoles that was probably one of the biggest jumps from one generation to the other. I think it's kind of slept on. I think a lot of people are used to this console, but from the Nintendo DS Lite to the Nintendo DSi, there were a lot of things that this console brought to the table that I was super shocked about, and I still think for the most part, this type of gaming console, it's actually pretty insane that this type of jump came from one generation and that it's this slept on in my personal opinion. Even with the Nintendo Switch 2, there were little tiny things that this particular console brought that I still see inside of my Nintendo Switch 2, which is so crazy to think about. Now, would I recommend buying this type of console right now? Maybe not, but there are still a lot of reasons why this would be a console like, hey, if you want to go ahead and buy a console and use it, then, by all means go for it. Because there's still a lot of reasons to go and own this thing. Now, first of all, this thing did come out many years ago. So it's not supposed to be competing with the latest and greatest, and it's not supposed to be competing with things like a Nintendo Switch 2 or anything like that. But there are still little tiny remnants of this console inside of the Switch 2, like I mentioned. Number one, this was that dual screen type of gaming console. So you were essentially able to go through and basically get your standard type of gaming console here. So it still looked good, I like the way it looked for the most part. And I used my Nintendo my Nintendo DS like all the time. So within this particular console, I would use this device like all the time, and I would go through and just basically, use my Nintendo DS Lite. And I never really noticed with my Nintendo DSi basically what the main differences were. I thought they were essentially the same thing. When you look at the outside though, one of the easiest ways to tell that you have a DSi over the DS Lite was that camera setup. So this thing basically had two cameras on it. It had a back camera and a front camera. That right there is honestly one of the biggest things in the world, because it wasn't even until like many years later did we start having like front cameras inside of our phones. So this thing already had two cameras from the back side and the front side. And even when I go through and kind of look at this console from that particular side, that is already such a big difference. I think that was really cool. Again, would people end up using this camera? Probably not. But it was still something that was really cool that Nintendo just kind of threw in here. And personally for me, like I mentioned, that was another really cool thing that they kind of threw in here. Now, I would also say that when you're going through and kind of using this particular console, another really big thing to keep in mind here too is that if you're going to go through and you're going to use this particular device, you're going to have to remember that there are still a lot of games available. There's still a lot of stuff available for this console, and it was backwards compatible with basically all Nintendo Switch games, Nintendo DS games for the most part as well. So that was something that was actually pretty cool that was kind of going on here as well. Now, another really big thing to keep in mind here that I actually really did like was that with this particular console, the design of it was mostly unchanged from the Nintendo DS Lite, but one thing that they did end up kind of doing here was that with the LED lights in the top left, they did kind of add some additional lights here. So there was one for like Wi-Fi, there was one for power, and one for it being plugged in. And that was actually also another nice touch. The DS Lite had some lights there too, but I think the DSi's lights they just looked a lot better. When you open this thing up, you got those two screens inside. And the screens inside were actually pretty good. They looked really bright. They performed very well for that time. The big thing though was when you're looking around it, like I said, you have that camera in the middle, you have your ABXY buttons. You also had this power button that moved from being on the side to an actual dedicated button. This was also another cool thing that they kind of threw in here, because before it was actually a slide up switch, but now it was like a dedicated power button that you can just click on. And that right there as well was like another cool thing that they kind of threw in here. And like I said before, if you were to go through and kind of use this phone from that particular perspective, that was also another cool little tiny thing that they threw in there when it came down to it. And like I said before, I was a massive fan of that type of layout when it came down to it from that side. When you finally turn this thing on though, this is where things get even more interesting. The whole entire user interface of this particular gaming console completely changed. Before with the DS Lite, it was basically you turn it on and then you find PictoChat or you find your game to play. And that was mostly it for the most part. Like there really wasn't anything else super crazy you could do with it if you didn't already have a game installed. With the Nintendo Switch or the Nintendo DS, what they ended up doing here was they actually ended up giving us a lot more capability when it came down to it. They now gave us the capability within the DSi to essentially go through and just basically play these types of games. And we can even go inside of their eShop or the DSiWare shop at the time and basically be able to play even more games and download games as long as we had an SD card, right? And this thing had an SD card slot inside of it too. So there was so much capability from that side, which was so sick. And I was a massive fan of this type of device when it came down to it from that particular situation. And I genuinely do think that if you were to go through and like pick up a device, this is something that was super cool. Now, was it like the best thing in the world? At that time, it was actually really cool. For a portable gaming console, it was something that was really awesome. And I thought in and of itself, that was a really cool thing. That was something that was super sick. Now, the UI itself was very unique because even now, it was like the square design boxes. It basically looked pretty cool. When I look at my Nintendo Switch 2, right, I can see how there is a lot of overlap here between my Nintendo DSi and my Nintendo Switch 2. Like, it might seem super crazy, but I genuinely do see a lot of overlap here. Like, when I look at both, like, you see the square boxes, you see the tiles, kind of. There is a lot of overlap here. And that is in and of itself, again, another really interesting thing when I go and kind of use this console. It just really stands out to me that the Nintendo DSi really was ahead of its time in so many different ways. So I do think in that particular situation, that was a really big thing because this thing also went through and it did kind of, push Nintendo to kind of go ahead and make the 3DS the way that they did, right? A portable 3D console that could go through and, give you a lot of capability from that standpoint. That was also another really cool thing that Nintendo kind of did at that point. And when you take a look at it from that side as well, that's another really big step in the right direction. So I do see a lot of overlap here. And I still think there's so many games available for the Nintendo DS that if you've never played Nintendo DS games before, there's no other feeling to play it rather than on the original hardware. There's 10 billion ways to do it via an emulator, but if you don't want to do it via an emulator, you have the capability of kind of going through and buying something, like a Nintendo DSi and buying all the games behind it as well. And you can go through and utilize this thing and play all those types of games and have that much capability behind it, which is such an amazing thing to basically be able to do here. So I will definitely tell you from that side, this type of console really does do a good job at kind of giving you that type of experience. So definitely what I'll tell you is, in my personal opinion, if I'm looking at this type of console, right, I am a massive fan of the Nintendo DSi. I think it's a very good console. I think it's still worth buying for sure if you've never even went through and bought this type of gaming console before. I think it definitely makes a lot of sense, right? I do think if you're in the market and you're wanting to go through and maybe pick up a different type of device, I think a Nintendo 3DS would probably make more sense for the most part. I think if you're going to go through and pick up one of those ones, that one would probably make more, sense in my personal opinion than this one. But I would still say for the most part, if you're going to go through and pick up this type of gaming console, it still has so much capability behind it. It still has so much power behind it. And I would highly recommend people to buy this type of console here for the most part when it comes down to it. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.